This morning, I am in Washington, D.C., talking with Gene P. O'Grady, who is the Director of Research and Knowledge Services for DLA Piper, LLP. Gene, it is our custom to begin with a little information about you as an individual, as a normal person type person. Could you tell us a little bit about your life, including perhaps both when you were young and today?
Okay. I grew up in New York, and I was born in the Bronx and grew up in Queens, and came from a family with neither of my parents had been to college. My father was a policeman, my mother was a homemaker. I have to admit, and this is so incredibly politically incorrect, that I never had any ambition to have a career. I wanted to get married and raise children because that's all I knew about. And
That's
then,
what women traditionally did, even after World War II, where they had
and
started
I'm not
working, they went back into the
I'm not
homes.
ashamed either way. I'm not
Yeah.
ashamed of having wanted that, and I'm sort of just surprised that I've ended up having a pretty incredible career. That's the only reason I mentioned it, is because my career sort of happened. I went to college in the 60s, and the entire deck got shuffled, and my life ended up taking a very, very different trajectory than I
You're
ever would have
really part of
anticipated.
the transformation of what women do from being homemakers primarily to being professionals.
Right, and I often mention it. I've mentioned this on my blog. When I was in college, the New York Times divided jobs into male and female. There were columns. There was a section of male jobs and a section of female jobs. And guess where librarian jobs were listed? Going back to my theme of how much does a legacy, the stereotyped, which are not always positive. There are lots of very positive intellectual stereotypes of librarians, but I think the dominant popular culture stereotypes of librarians are fairly negative and cartoonish.
You're still seen in the cartoons
Oh,
of a
a
librarian, the
month-
lady with the bun hair,
a
and
month
the
doesn't
pencil
go
sticking
by.
out of her ear,
Right.
above her ear.
Right.
Yeah.
A month doesn't go by where it doesn't show up on a TV show or in a in an advertisement or a movie. It's a constant. So that has, I think, affected, especially as I've gotten further along into my career, I've taken a lot more seriously how that may be impacting the professional trajectory of information professionals in law firms in particular, because I think in academia it's a little bit of a different structure. I mean, I think the way law schools are organized, maybe you could become a dean like Bob Baring did, but in law firms there's that whole C-suite issue. So getting back to me and my background, I went to college. I went to Fordham University. I was a history major, and I was also the third class of women who were admitted because it was traditionally an all-male Jesuit school. And I was technically in a school called Thomas More College, which was the college for women, although we took classes together. But there I was, right, at the in a very disruptive point in our culture and in our history. And then the 60s came, the war came. Yes.
Yeah, there was a tremendous pushback against our involvement in Vietnam and the war.
Right.
And in society in general, you had tremendous changes in social rules on
Yeah.
governing
I mean,
how you dealt with minorities.
I
and so
took
on.
buses to D.C. for marches on Washington. I did many. It was part. I was part of that fabric. In fact, somebody had actually bought me a ticket to Woodstock, and I got sick, and I never got to go to Woodstock. But actually, when I was watching what was going on TV, I was so glad I wasn't there because I hate dirt and mud.
When I first came to American U, 40-some years back now, in our catalog to promote the school, the law school, we had pictures of the unrest by students here in D.C. and the marches around the circle there where American U is and so on. And times changed very dramatically, very quickly, and sort of away from that sort of thing. And we had to yank those pictures out. The few years later would be the wrong message. But it was a very interesting time you were part of.
Yeah.
I was part of the beginning of it, but it was fascinating. So you were part of that era. You decided then to.
Well, interestingly, after I got out of college, I didn't go right to graduate school. I had a number of jobs, and all of them were law related. I worked first for the Vera Institute of Justice on a court reform project, and then I became a detective in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, which is no longer on my resume, but it was an interesting opportunity where I learned a lot about investigations. Then when New York City went broke in 1975, I was laid off, and there was some creative time taking art classes and other things. I moved to Massachusetts, and then I moved back to New York and took a job with the New York Foundling Hospital in their legal department. And my job was working with legal files. It had to do with freeing children in foster care for adoption. And my job was to go through these massive case files and look for the parents of the children. And there was a lot of searching public records. Any event, you weren't actually supposed to find the parents. You were supposed to show the court that you had gone looking for the parents. But I kept finding these lost parents. And, so that was the first indicator to me that I had a really good knack for research. And I didn't particularly like that job. I didn't think I was going to stay there as a career. And I happened to answer an ad in the Village Voice where somebody was looking for a researcher, and I called this writer and I said, I want to be a researcher for you. And he said, well, if you have a full-time job, I need research done in libraries, and you can't go to libraries during the day. He said, why don't you become a librarian? And I had actually, sadly, never connected librarians with research. I connected them with cataloging, and although I have very fond memories of libraries throughout all of my life, I've always felt very at home in libraries. And in fact, I'll tell you about a little incident. When I was growing up, I lived across the street from the Queens Village Public Library. And one day I went in there, and I don't know how old I was, but I was standing in the lobby, and I had this almost like light bulb moment where something came on and said, I'm home here. This is libraries are my home. But yet I don't know why, I never followed it as a career. It didn't stay in my mind as something, oh yes, I'm going to become a librarian.
Sounded like you were more inclined to follow your father at one point.
Right, no, it's
in
true.
Law
It's
enforcement,
yes.
And then from there into investigative work.
It's true. And then, and I actually, all of those skills and all of those experiences have been incredibly helpful in my career as a librarian. It's been a very odd but interesting path.
Well, it sounds like it was a lot of fun too,
Yeah.
getting there. Before we sort of move on to that path a little more, could I ask you sort of one follow-up
Sure.
to about you as sort of a person? Do you have any particular hobbies or other special passions
Well,
that
yeah.
occupy time, perhaps when you're not working, if there is such a chance?
Well, writing has become my predominant passion. I don't have a lot of time. I married late and I adopted children, so I have children in high school. I am demographically I am my own private demographic. I'm actually pretty close to retirement age, but I will not be able to retire because I have high school age children, and I am actually, like some people are a soccer mom, I am a marching band mom, and my son is very musically talented, so I spend a lot of time getting him to competitions and various events and practices.
Like he's really into it. What
Yes.
instrument or instruments does
Many.
he play?
He plays 5 instruments. Right now his predominant instrument is the flute, but he also plays the piano, the violin, the cello, and the trumpet. He's learning the trumpet just for fun.
I have a grandson who plays the trumpet. He's 6th grade, and he's been doing it for 2
Yeah.
years in the school band.
No. And it's just wonderful to watch somebody develop, because, it's interesting because when we adopted him, we had received a video from the orphanage in Russia, and it showed him dancing. And, it was real clear that music was passion. So when we brought him home, the first thing we did was put on a music video called Grandpa's Magic Toys, and that was what made him comfortable with us. So so he always knew the music passion was there.
Well, music is the international language,
Yes.
the universal language.
Yes.
Everybody understands it no matter what your primary language
Right,
is.
right.
Or
And my,
speech.
my daughter is very artistic, and I don't know, she's torn between being an artist and a veterinarian, so we're not sure where that's going. But anyway, that takes up a lot of my time. I run, I bike, I love Zydeco and Cajun dancing. And mostly now, I think, because I don't have a lot of free time, I'm sort of beginning to project on what will I do when I retire, when I'm able to retire. And the things I'm thinking about are, I want to, because I live near the Potomac River. It never occurred to me when I moved to D.C. that D.C. is sort of a water town. There's rivers everywhere. And
There are, yes.
and so I live near the Potomac, and I plan to take up rowing. There are actually rowing clubs for adults in D.C. I also
used to see them out
Yeah.
above the Chain Bridge.
Right.
Below Chain Bridge and I guess Georgetown.
right.
Key Bridge.
So in my mind, my future will involve learning the cello, doing rowing, doing the walk in Spain, San Juan Capistrello. I want to do that, and I have some. I also plan to write books. I think that writing my blog has given me a lot of courage about my ability to write, and I have some historic issues. I love history, so I'm going to. I sort of keep a log of ideas for books that have not yet been written that I would like to write. So, I do plan to have some very active things going on. The other thing is, I think one thing that is commonly said to me is, oh my God, you have to become a consultant when you retire because everybody will hire you, and that's a nice thing to hear, But who knows? I mean,
Some people do it, some
Yes,
don't.
yeah.
You get
Yeah.
the opportunity to make the choice.
right?
after you're
Exactly,
retired. Yeah.
exactly.
My former deputy refers to retirement as the every morning is Saturday morning club, and he's right. It's really it's a nice time of life, I think. So it sounds like you have a few interests, including continuing to get your kids launched.
Yes.
That'll happen
Lucky
sooner
me.
than you realize.
Yeah.
If they're in high school, it's not
Yes.
much longer, and it sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So.
Then you'll have more freedom to enjoy
Well,
your
that's
own
that's
passion.
it. I enjoy it, but obviously, between my work and my kids, there's not a lot of bandwidth. And then, people are always laughing because I post my blogs like at 2 a.m. in the morning because that's I certainly I don't have I don't want to do it. It's
Was
not appropriate
looking
for me
at
to do it
that
here.
recently in anticipation of coming here today, and I noticed the timestamps that they look like they were put up in the early morning. And I
Yeah,
thought,
'cause
I
that's
wonder
the
if
only-
that's the time difference because I was on the West Coast or something.
No, it's because that's the only time I can write, and sometimes, I'm just exhausted when I write, but I want to, I give myself deadlines,
Well, you had
so
quite a
that
bit on that blog.
Yeah.
We'll talk about maybe a little more in a few minutes about it, but it was interesting reading it when I was looking at it to sort of find out more about you in anticipation of today. But speaking about you, you've mentioned that you went to Jesuit college that was newly integrated from this point of the genders. Talk about your other degrees and your other college work. You have 3 degrees.
Right. So then after following this conversation with the man I never met named Frank from the Village Voice, who was a writer, I started looking around for MLS degrees, and in New York there was Columbia, Queens College, and St. John's, and St. John's would let me in without taking the GREs, and it was like the class was starting Monday or something. So I went and I got my application in, and I started going to class, and I loved it. I quit my job. I started going to class, and unfortunately, I was living at home with my parents, which was not great at that point. But it got me through. It only took me about a year or so, and I got the first job that I guess I saw posted. I'm not sure whether it was in the newspaper or on a bulletin board, but it was at Pace Law School, and it was a night librarian, and it was called a circulation librarian, but really what I did was file loose leaf services. And
You did what they needed
and it was,
done.
I think that was, that was an important thing to understand how they worked and how good or how bad filing instructions could be. And, nobody will know what I'm talking about, but the Oceana instructions were
people did not deal with those.
famously incomprehensible. They would tell you to file sections that weren't included
Yeah.
or in books that didn't exist. It was hilarious. So I did, it was a good. A couple of important things about that was I shared I shared my halftime slot with a woman named Eleanor Sabo, who we are friends to this day, and Lucy Merritt worked there, and another woman named Diane Hayward. And later on in our career, what we used to do is go to we all got I think we all ended up eventually in law firms, and we would go to AALL, and then we would do road trips from whatever conference, like, when it was in Minnesota, we went up to Thunder Bay, and when it was in New Orleans, we drove around and we went to Mississippi, and we went looking for the Evangeline Oak. We just had we stayed
a specific target.
right,
for
like
your
we would start
destination.
planning wherever the conference was going to be. We would plan an after the conference road trip, and we had so many laughs and so many wonderful times. One time we stayed in a haunted house in, I think, St. Francisville, which was either in Mississippi or Louisiana, but we just had a ball. And then, sadly, Lucy and Eleanor, Diane's firm fell apart and she went off to work on her own. Eleanor went off and got additional degrees and had a second career as first she went to, I think, FIT to learn design, and then she became a teacher, and now she's retired from that. And Lucy, I think, was still in law firms, but we didn't, it's sort of like the magic was broken. We didn't.
It wasn't the same.
Yeah, we
group.
sort of lost. Yeah. But I have to confess, when they were gone, I got a lot more serious about going to programs at AALL.
Maybe I should flip this part
Yes,
out.
no, I have to confess, PLL always had like 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. meetings. I never made one. We were.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
we
were young.
had so few slots.
We were young party girls, and
well, why not? Did you ever?
I never thought I would be sort of seen as a sober member of.
Did you ever go on? I remember there was a meeting someplace on the West Coast one year, and there was a adventure for those who wanted to go to Hawaii or something.
No, we didn't do that, and that might have
that.
even been before my time. I don't remember that, but we did one time drive up the coast. The year it was in San Diego, we drove up the coast of California and made about 5 or 6 stops, and that was another wonderful
Did you take
trip.
California the road
Yes,
that goes
yes, we
along
went.
the
We
cliffs
took the
over
Coast
ocean?
Highway.
Yes.
And it was a wonderful.
That's a scary ride for
Yes.
some people, but
Yes, but there were 4 of
gorgeous
us, so we switched. We
scenery.
would switch driving. We had 4 drivers.
Well, that must have been fun. Did you go as far up as the Bay Area, San Francisco?
Yeah, and I think we went past. I think we got to Shasta. Shasta is above there.
Yeah,
Mount
Sha-
Shasta.
Yeah,
we
Shasta
want.
is east of there.
Yeah,
a
we
bit,
thought of
but,
trying
a
to
little
get
bit
to
north.
Washington, or we didn't get that far. But
Well, if you got as far as where Mount Shasta is, you were awfully close to Oregon.
yeah, we sort of lost our energy, or we had to go home.
Yeah.
But those were wonderful
Did you get
adventures.
into any of the parks in that area? Because
Yes.
Yosemite is not far. south
Well, we
of
went to
Shasta.
Redwood. We saw the redwoods.
The redwoods.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those
And
are-
we went to the Hearst Mansion.
yeah,
We just
St.
a lot
Simeon.
of whatever yes, we did a lot of sightseeing along the way.
That sounds like it was a lot of fun.
It was.
Well, here you are. You now have an MLS. Somewhere along the way, you got a law degree.
That was later. Let's see. So I stayed at Pace for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was doing the part-time work as a circulation, and I took over the summer. My career started to take off when St. John's offered a summer legal research program taught by Ralph Monaco, who I love, He just retired from the New York Law Institute. But Eleanor and I took that class together. And it was really embarrassing. Like, finally, I knew what I was talking about, because at that point, people would come into the law school and say, where's the CFR, where's the Fed Sup? And I was like, and I would say things like, is that state? It's down on the second level. Is that federal? It's up one. I mean, I just knew nothing. They had no business referring to me as a reference librarian, because I knew nothing until I took Ralph's class. So, and later I had the opportunity to teach that same class at St. John's, and I really appreciated, what an influence Ralph was for me. And I wanted to be that influence for other people. So it was great to stand in his shoes later on.
Also discovered those shoes involved a lot of preparation.
Right.
for
Oh
that
my goodness.
class.
I sort of regarded. I also taught at Long Island University at the library school. I taught a class there, and I began to refer to part-time academic work. It's sort of like being a migrant worker. You put in tons of hours for like at the end of the day you make like 47 cents an hour.
Yeah, the adjunct faculty are not overcompensated.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
But I enjoy it. It was a labor of love. I enjoyed it. It was.
Well, it sounds interesting. Now, I have a follow-up question that was not in our prepared summary of things we talked about. When you were at Pace, was Barty Wolf there?
Yes, and I should mention Barty Wolf. He was there. We went through a succession of temporary directors. I mean, I was actually there when Ludwig Tekloff was the first director, and then
I remember him.
I think it was Barty, and then Greg Costa took over, and I can't remember exactly the order, but
Barty left there to go to Florida.
Right, but Barty was, I have to tell you, I stood with Barty and watched them roll in the first Lexus Deluxe terminal, the thing that was the size of a washing machine. And the thing I took away from Barty, even though I didn't work closely with him because I worked nights, I remember him being willing to do fairly radical things. And I remember him saying he was going to get rid of all of, I think it might have been the digest. There was something that he was going to get rid of now that we had electronic resources. He felt certain things. And that was a real eye-opener. And I think the other thing he talked about doing was putting rubber bands around books to see if they were used. Because, again, obviously, I know now he was responding to economic pressures. And how do I understand the usage of my collection? We have better resources than. I've done the rubber band thing myself at points in my career. But I learned from him to be a little bit iconoclastic. And that has followed me in my career.
Barty's career, he started the same time I did in Texas. I was at Houston, and he was at Texas as a night librarian of some sort with Roy Mirsky as the director. And Barty and I got to know each other, and then our careers moved about the same time. He ended up at Cleveland State when OBAR was being put together, and he was on the ground floor of automated legal research as a result of that in the working world, the real world. And, so that followed into Pace, and then eventually to St. Thomas. That background and that appreciation of what that could do.
Yeah.
He had it before most of us knew very much about it, except that it was new and expensive.
Because it really did make, as I said, he made quite an impression on me, even though we didn't actually have a lot of contact. But there were a few conversations where I saw he was making his own rules, and it taught me you can make your own rules, and that I think is something I've kept with me.
Yeah. Well, Barty was a wonderful friend too. I mean, it's a shame he's no longer with us. But he was great. I did a chapter visit when I was on the executive board of the association, and it was South Florida where he was. And Barty came to the airport to get me, and showed me all around and got me to the meeting. I did my thing, and treated me very well, and got me back to the airport, and I went on home. But it was wonderful to have him as a host and to talk to him, sort of informally in the car while we were driving around and looking at things. And he was a good guy.
Yeah.
You had a good experience, I hope, with him.
Yes.
Sounds like you did.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about you've sort of alluded to kind of coming into the field of law librarianship a little at a time, maybe, by phrasing.
Sort of sideways, yes.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of things. I've come in through the window instead of the door, but I get there.
One of the questions I like to ask is, sort of, how did you decide to become a law librarian, sort of in a full way, and did anyone in particular have a role in helping you come to that decision?
No, it was accidental. It was completely accidental. Before getting my first law firm job, I actually worked briefly at the first full-time job that became available was actually available at the Pace Undergraduate Library. So I went and I worked there, and I worked actually with a wonderful librarian named Richard Kukta, who became the librarian at the Folgers Shakespeare Library. And if you read my blog post as Librarian as Hero, he is the librarian who recovered one of the stolen Shakespeare folios. And it's a fantastic story. You should go read that story on my blog post. And later, he sent me an email thanking me for the blog post about it, and he said I got the story correctly. He loved what I had written about the incredible expertise, because the librarians there actually had to convince the fraud guy that they were believing him, when in fact they saw all these signs that he was up to no good. And so they started conducting. Richard said to him, I'm going to have to test the paper or something like that. And it was, as soon as he saw it, it was obvious to him that it was a stolen folio. He was really suspicious. But he convinced the guy to leave the folio with him and come back the next week. And the staff just went to work doing, forensic librarianship. And Richard, I think, ultimately had to go to the UK to testify against
So it had
the
been
perpetrator.
stolen from a library there?
No, it was called the Durham folio. It was stolen from Durham University.
Okay.
And so it was just a great story. So we reconnected here in DC briefly. So that was a wonderful thing. But we were both just reference librarians together at Pace. And then I'm trying to remember. I can't actually remember how I ended up in private firms. I guess I applied for jobs, and the first job I was offered was at Proskauer. And I have to tell you, I had applied for quite a few library jobs in firms, and I sort of got this brush off of
You were an academic, maybe.
exactly.
You didn't know that
Well,
side
it
of
was
the
like,
world.
well, you worked in academia. We're not sure you can handle deadlines. I mean, just with that, what? So I think it was a wonderful thing that I came into private firms with a real appreciation for the different kind of expertise. I mean, because I do think in some ways academic librarians do a different kind of research, perhaps more purely legal focused. In firms, there's a little bit different of a mix of law and business and maybe science and technology if they're doing IP work. So but I appreciate both sides, and Marcia Pront was the first person who didn't hold my academic career against me. And right around the same time, I believe I was also applying for law school. So and that was the other thing. Some of the academics didn't want to hire somebody who was going to law school at night. So I had been accepted at Fordham, and I was going to go to Fordham at night, and I started my job at Pace. And it was a very, very demanding job. It was quite something. I used to joke that I got 10 years of experience working a year at Proskauer. It was a very demanding job. But Marcia was a wonderful mentor. She taught me how to negotiate with vendors. She taught me also to be a very dogged researcher. She taught me don't give up. Even though she was the library director,
Now this is Marcia
Pront.
Pront.
Yes,
Yeah.
she
'Cause you
still
hadn't mentioned the name, and I wanted that in the
yes.
record.
She was a great influence in she was a wonderful mentor to me in both in learning about management, dealing with vendors, contract negotiation, and also on the research side about telling me not to give up and to be persistent. So that was a great experience. And then I can't remember exactly how, but I heard about an opportunity at a firm called Shea and Gould. And I am totally convinced to this day they hired me because I was the cheapest candidate, because I didn't have much experience and they had not really had a professional librarian running their library till that point. And so they hired me to straighten it out. But it's funny, here's another aside. At that point, one of the common things in New York law firms was that the people who hired for libraries were library partners. And usually those library partners were tax partners, because I think tax partners do a different kinds of research, and they wanted to make sure they had all the tax materials they wanted.
Oh yeah, they want everything, and it's got to be
exactly
completely up to date, and it's all expensive.
Right. So I was interviewed by two tax partners, and they hired me. And I know now it wasn't based on my experience. It was based on my really pitiful salary requirements.
Well, you were a pioneer as a student during the period of sort of the repercussions of being in an unpopular war and other things. But when you came into the private law firm sector, you were a pioneer in another sense, in that firms were still sort of early on and becoming aware that librarians could offer something that they needed to the equation.
That's absolutely true. And when I got to Shea and Gould, like they probably had a Lexis terminal, but they had never had dialogue research. And I'll never forget this. They were representing Ariel Sharon and his litigation against Time Magazine. And Ariel Sharon used to come and sit in my library all the time. The Prime Minister of Israel. And so he, the library was not professionally organized. The books were arranged by colored dots. It was absolutely incomprehensible, and I convinced them to let me hire a real cataloger so we could put the books
They
into.
moved beyond the era
Right.
when they had some books to impress clients who saw them.
Right.
That they never really used
Right.
much, because they knew what they did on an everyday
Right.
basis enough.
But also, I began going out and talking to the attorneys about what did they need to know beyond case law, because I said, I have access to this thing called dialogue, and I can get you all kinds of information. I can get you business information. I can get you scientific information. I can find out what was written contemporaneously about, obviously in the Sharon case, they needed to know, because it was a libel case, and they needed to know news coverage. And I said, I can do that. And I was probably the first person who said, I have special skills to help you get all this historical news information. And so, it turned out, I think that was probably the point at which I became a law librarian in my soul, because I realized that I was good at something and people appreciated what I was doing. And I have to confess, I was not a terribly good on the business side of running a library. I was still, even though that was my title, I developed my business skills later on in my career. I was a very good, researcher, and maybe that was the important thing to do at that point, because to break down the mold of your job is to keep the books on the shelves, to get the attention of the partners, and to say, I had the partners, I became the person who trained the associates. I mean, the head of the litigation department would insisted that I meet with all the associates. At one point, he actually had me go and train the associates in the not the associates, the lawyers in the GC, a big client. He wanted me to go teach the lawyers in the general counsel's office. So I had it opened up lots of doors. My research competencies and my non-traditional, I was doing things people weren't expecting me to do, and it really got their attention. And I just want to relate one instance, which I think was a sort of a hilarious learning moment for me. West was at that point selling Ultrafeast, which was a way to get the entire National Reporter system into a file cabinet. And you had to buy a special lens for the microfilm copier.
Also solving another problem they had because the early volumes, they had melted down the original plates during World War II.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
they were faced with running out of stock and how they'd been reproducing them.
I had no idea.
And they either had to completely, set them back up so they could keep publishing them, or come up with an alternative. And they thought, well, the market was small enough and there were a lot of used sets that the Ultrafeast was the solution to giving you a complete back run if you wanted it, without them going to the capital expense of having to have it
Right.
put together so they could actually publish them.
Right. And it's funny, so anyway, so I go into this partner's office. I have the price. No, I don't even have the price. I have the linear feet of shelves that it would save. And I tell him about why it would be so wonderful for us to get this. And he said to me, so how much would it cost? And he was
Question the
so
partners
kind.
ask.
He was actually quite a formidable, and he could be quite hard on the associates. And he was very kind to me. He didn't humiliate me. He said, Jean, please come back with the price and we'll talk about it. And to this day, it's one of those things I look back on is like, how did I not know to never have a conversation with a partner without knowing the price? The other interesting aha moment for me was on my first day when I was being taken around to meet the partners. The tax partner who had hired me brought me into the esteemed, very old and esteemed partners' offices, and I said to one partner, well, I'll see you in the library. And he gave me this look and he said, no, you won't. As if no partner ever goes into the library. That is a place for associates. And that sort of like, it's also been a curious thing, and it's also something I think we have had to overcome as a profession, that now we go well beyond serving the associates. Certainly that's a core thing to do, but the notion that we could never have anything to offer partners
Well, now
is,
the library is more or less that you can service
Right,
it
we
as
do,
opposed
we
to
do.
a physical place that
Right.
they have to come.
right.
Is
So,
that
but it was
pretty much
just,
the norm?
it was, I was sort of taken aback that, like, oh, you're just here for the associates. You have nothing to do with what I do. And that was interesting. So you learn by your mistakes, and I think one of the things I would say for newer librarians is to not let your gaffes, don't define yourself by your gaffes. And that was one of my early and astonishing gaffes. And then I think around that time I was asked to speak at a PLI, and that was the first time I ever spoke in public. And you see I have this glass of water here. That is because at my first public speaking opportunity, I had massive dry mouth. I had just like where I couldn't, like it was practically croaking. I could not talk. So I have never, to this day, I have never gotten onto a podium without water next to me. And it was incredibly embarrassing. And yet my career didn't end because of it, and my speaking career didn't end because of it,
Unfortunately, our careers don't end because we make a few mistakes
Yes.
early on, especially. I mean, it's called getting experience.
Yes, exactly. The other thing I want to point to, going back to Marcia Pront at Proskauer, I can also remember her on the microfiche issue. Like, she was always sort of in her head inventing new solutions. She was inventing databases in her head, and I would sit through her having long talks with someone from West or someone from Lexis or some publisher, telling them how they ought to build their products. She was very, very insistent that they were not really seeing how, the future of the way information needed to be delivered. And she gave me some early insights into automation and usability. And she also gave me a passion for communicating to vendors about the important usability and how important it is for publishers to put themselves in the seat of the users, and to really take that seriously, and how we in our role could be very passionate advocates for improving products and improving the way things were priced or, usability issues. So I think she gave me a lot of insights into our roles as advocates.
Well, as you say, it helps them, the publishers, to know what it is that our people need, and then they can figure out how to supply it, rather than trying to guess about something that they're not really part of.
Right.
I mean, they're in the book business, not the law practice business or the law education business. So they need the feedback. It has to be two-way.
So, I continued that with my role, and there's two more things I want to say about my experience at Shea and Gould. And one was that I had I built my first knowledge management system there, and this was back in 1987, when no one was doing knowledge management. We bought a West Private file, and I worked with a litigator there, and he worked with me on selecting litigation documents for this brief bank. And I look back now, and it's like I built one of the early KM systems, and it's unfortunate. I let myself get a little burned out at that job, and I left to become an independent consultant after a number of years, and I sort of now regret it, because I think, given the fact that I was doing KM back then, I think staying with that might have given me more of an opportunity to take on more KM through my career. I've done it again, but I think having taken it on so early in my career, I do regret making that particular career decision, because I think for a number of reasons it sort of derailed it derailed me for a few years, and I had to get my career back on track. But I just needed a rest. I needed a rest at that point. The other thing I wanted to say was, it was the first place where I had the opportunity to break some rules on my own, to go out on a limb.
Back to Barty Wolf.
Back to Barty Wolf. And one of the things, well, Shea and Gould doesn't exist anymore, so I can say this. They were, in those days, they were really, really cheap. I mean, we didn't even buy the commercial cards for catalog cards. We used index cards and punched holes in them. I mean, it was just insanely frugal. And we kept borrowing a Warren Gourmand treatise. I think it was something to do with tax appeals. We kept borrowing it. And one day I sat down and I did the math. And I said to myself, it would be much cheaper to just buy the book. So instead of going and asking for permission to buy the book, I just bought the book and decided if anybody came and questioned me, I was going to show them the math on the messenger costs and just not worry about it. Because I think sometimes, I don't want to get into the whole gender politics thing, but maybe it's my age, maybe it's my library training. I think librarians can sometimes be a little timid about always wanting absolute permission before they take certain steps, even when they know in their brain this is the right thing to do. And the second instance I had at Shea and Gould for this was we signed our first Westlaw contract, and they had some sort of a special deal where they would give you so many PCs. And at that point, no one had PCs. We had dedicated Citrix terminals. But they were, I guess they were trying to get out of the equipment business. And I went to the IT director and I told him about this, and he said, absolutely not. No, we're not bringing any equipment in here that does not, I control all the equipment. We're not getting any equipment that doesn't belong to me. And then I went back to the partner who I had the microfilm gaff with, and I said, West offered us this pretty good deal where we can do this thing, and they'll give us 5 computers. What do you think? And he signed it.
I'll bet he signed it.
He signed it, and then
give computers.
Exactly. It's the old. It's easier to get forgiveness than permission.
Absolutely.
And so then the equipment arrives. The day comes, the equipment arrives, and I'm trying to figure out, how do we hide the equipment? And we actually we put it up. We put it up on shelves. We had cabinets, And we were actually, I think we were going to get rid of dedicated terminals and replace them with the computers. And one day, somebody who worked for the IT director came in and saw the boxes of IBM computers and went back and told Ralph. And Ralph called me up and was having an absolute apoplexy at me. And I said, Ralph, Leon Gold signed off on it and they were free. And, there were no repercussions from that. But, I have to say, I wasn't entirely comfortable going out on a limb like that, but I know it was absolutely the right thing to do. And I think you have to be really judicious in making those choices. There are times when you can be dead wrong and I'm sure you can lose your job. And this was, I thought, a fairly safe chance to take. But it wasn't in my grain to be that combative or that in your face. But I did it, and it was better because we were able to use these terminals for other things. For the first time, the cataloger had an IBM computer she could do cataloging on, and of course at Westlaw we did use it for Westlaw too. But it was just a great
we
experience.
We slipped a lot of them in over those early years through little side deals like that.
Yeah.
Another source was OCLC. They went to smart PC-based terminal, and we got an extra one that way because it slipped in as part of that package.
Yeah.
But it was scary times to be out on the front on some of that.
Yeah. But I also have to say, looking back, I got into this job. I'm a director. I had no primary prior experience. But you know how I survived? I called my colleagues, and colleagues are so generous. And even you mentioned Jack Ellenberger. I called Jack Ellenberger, asked him for advice. Marsha Prant, Linda Holmes, who I had worked with at Pace, was at Brooklyn Law School. At one time, I got this insane question about the revised statutes that I didn't know how to answer, and I called Linda, and she knew exactly what the revised statutes of the or the revised code. It was something that law firms didn't normally have, and she helped me navigate that one. So my colleagues I have never been alone. I have always turned to colleagues to say, how have you done this? Have you ever faced this situation? How do I do this better? And we have always been incredibly...
reinvent the wheel.
Exactly.
Others have already done it. Take advantage of what you can. You mentioned Jack Ellenberger, and we did talk about him, but it was off camera, so I want to mention that he was, at that time, I think, the librarian at Sherman and Sterling
Yes.
in New York.
Yes.
He'd been here
Yes.
at a couple of places before that, here in Washington, D.C., but Jack is one of those, real leaders, and I'm going to have the pleasure, I hope, if his health will allow, I get to talk with him on camera next week for this project.
Although Jack was the outlier in the survey I was doing. I was doing a survey about having our librarians bill for their time. And Jack said no, he didn't believe they did, but other firms were beginning to experiment with it, and I got it approved. And, it was interesting because at the time, so our librarians, and I was able to hire some wonderful librarians while I was at Shane Gould, Shireen Kumar, and Linda Barbone. They're both library directors in New York now. Wonderful colleagues. We had a great time there. But where was I going? What was I talking about before? I was going someplace.
You were breaking
about the
rules.
survey with the billable time. So because I now had reference librarians working for me, and I knew that they were doing things that were uniquely valuable to clients, I wanted to bill for their time. And so we did get a billing rate approved. I have no idea what it was, but we had a billing rate approved. And I remember one time a partner came into my office, and this is actually a very good insight into the dilemma we still face today. The partner came into my office, and I believe whatever the librarian had done, it had taken very, very little time. And it was only maybe 15 minutes of time, but they had used a database, maybe a dialogue database to identify an expert, something like that. And he said, this is only 15 minutes. I can't put it on a client bill because it's too small. And I was like, but if you had given this to an associate, it would have taken 6 hours, and here we sit today. We were at the forefront of introducing incredibly efficient ways of doing things, and the billable hour is still not gone, but it uncovered for me the paradox of being somebody who could introduce a lot of efficiency, and yet lawyers were not willing to make that something they wanted to sell to clients.
Yeah.
We're not going to sell the efficiency of somebody who's not a lawyer, although many of us were. So it was an interesting, insight into a dilemma we still face today, and which lawyers are grappling with. How do we represent efficiency? And I think librarians absolutely play an important role in delivering more efficient service to clients, whether it's introducing efficient products, establishing best practices, doing the research, doing heroic Herculean research really, really quickly and really, really efficiently, that had it been handed to somebody else without our expertise, would have ended up as, a 2-week project on a client bill.
Clients often today sort of second guess billing a little bit more than they used
Yeah,
to?
that's a whole nother, everything gets analyzed. So
I would think
we could spend the rest of the afternoon talking
a more efficient way
about
of
that.
producing it would be in the firm's best interest.
Yes, that's, yes.
I mean, times have changed.
Yes.
I keep hearing. And even the passing through of library services as billable time has become a lot more common.
Yeah, I think almost everybody does.
Yeah. Well, it's
We
probably
more
good
than
for
recover the salaries of the
making
research
library
staff.
more viable as
Right.
an organization. It's no longer seen as a drop for money.
Right,
It's
and
a source.
right, and I also think as we shrink the amount of administrative work that we do, and I'll talk more about that when we get to the next phase of my career. But that I think absolutely we are at a phase of strategic value adding in law firms today. So
the next phase, is that when you move to DC?
well,
Or are we still?
let me think. So yes, well, the next phase was I sadly left Shea & Gould, I believe in the early 90s. Worked for myself. This was really silly. I mean, there was also a recession going on, so my timing has not always been great. So I left Shea & Gould, set myself up sort of as a consultant in working out of my apartment. And the thing I really learned is that I hate working alone. Me and my computer were not terribly inspiring to each other. But at that time, I had also been elected the president of LAGNY. And I'll tell you an interesting experience at that time, and I think it relates somewhat to a little bit the turmoil that is going on with AALL and our identity today. Because I was working for myself and not at a law firm, colleagues of mine on the board actually suggested that I should resign because now I was a vendor. I was other. And I was introduced to the sort of fundamentalist, tribalist view of librarians as being, librarians must fit a certain profile, and if you're not in that profile, you're an alien. And I was actually pressured and disparaged and encouraged to resign as LAGNY president because I did not have a traditional job. And I didn't do it. But it felt bad. It didn't, I did not like that was going on. But again, I hung on,
Well, I remember the squabbles at the National Association over opening up regular membership to people who were not traditional librarians
Right.
in the way that's tended to be identified, mostly the vendor people, many of whom were librarians.
Right.
who were working to help coordinate the services and enhance the product and find out what we as librarians on our end thought we needed. I mean, this was all good.
Right, but again, doesn't that tie back to you're working in a place called a library? And I think,
Yes.
especially working in a firm, it has been so obvious that we have to get out of the place identification to the strategic value identification. And even librarians, take somebody like Mike Dane, who started out as a librarian and is now a VP at Thomson Reuters. I mean, I think that is a fantastic success story. There should be more of those.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't ostracize those people. But he's one of the few. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that as much as publishers come to us, whether it's in academic or in private firms, and clearly value our advice, when they hire librarians, what do they hire them to do? They hire them to be the librarian relations, where there's a place for that. That is,
Yeah.
I value that. That's a wonderful thing. But do they hire librarians that are more strategically placed in the publishing industry? Mike is pretty much the only exception I can think of. There may be others, but he is the most prominent exception I can think of. So it's sort of, and I don't mean to diminish a lot of these colleagues. It was a wonderful service for those client relations positions to be created, but in a sense, it is a party planning position. I think
Well, it certainly can be.
those librarians should have been given more opportunity to become
Cammie
other
King
things
at
within those
DNA
publishing.
moved up
Yes,
into,
yes,
the
Cammie is.
management level.
Yeah,
She's
she's
another exception.
Yes, Cammie, also a wonderful colleague. Yes, so.
But you're right, we can get pigeonholed if we're not
Right, and
careful.
I think we are also that ambivalence within the association about how are they one of us? Are they with us? Are they against us? And I think that has to drop, especially if we're going to bring people. The future is about collaboration, and I think you can even see in the way law firms are becoming publishers and publishers are becoming legal service providers. There are no longer the strict boundaries there used to be. So there are going to be lots of new places for the kind of skills we have. And if we stay too tied to this very, I know people are going to hate this term, but it's like a fundamentalist view of what a librarian is. We are cutting the next generation off not only from opportunities for jobs, but opportunities for influence. And you have influence by getting out of the library into the upper echelons of organizations.
I mean, we see this in academic law librarianship, in that the directors and sometimes other librarians get involved as faculty appointees in broader governance at the institution. And it can be very enriching and it can be very empowering. I went through that and I learned a great deal that was very useful as a library director to know. And I made contacts and got involved in policy decisions of the entire institution. And it was a wonderful opportunity to do that. But I had to get out of the library to do it somewhat.
Right, no, and I think we should be out of the library. I mean, a couple of years ago, I actually had an insight, because I've been on this theme about contemplating the what I think of, frankly, as a kind of plateauing of our career, and I referred to it yesterday in the blog as a glass ceiling, because the ALL is 75% female, and I believe in ALA, the American Association, their statistic is 83. So generically, it's a historic female position, and so I feel that by there's as we discussed before the video went on, there's a lot of baggage there, and we have to break through the baggage, and we should not be identified with career limiting things. If we want to bring new blood into the organization, I think we have to be offering people a career that is viable for the future. And as the last ALM survey said, that I can't remember the exact statistic, but something like, I'll guess 70% of AmLaw 100 law firms think that their libraries will be gone in the next 5 years. That is a very short window for us to redefine ourselves outside of the room called a library business.
Resell ourselves.
Exactly. Well, we already are, but I absolutely think that what happened in the 80s, we were right at the beginning of the information revolution. New people came into law firms and were given, as Greg Lambert says, he does this great presentation where he says, we introduced the internet, we introduced knowledge management, we introduced often professional development, we introduced competitive intelligence, and what happened? Other people were hired to take over those responsibilities. They were taken away from the librarian and given to somebody who then was elevated to the C-level. And while there are some exceptions, if you look at what has happened in IT and what has happened to librarians, I think we have to do self-examination and wonder what is going on that our messaging or our identity. And I think, again, it is partly because we go to ALL and we talk to each other. Mm-hmm. You know what I think happened? IT people didn't have an association. Marketing people didn't have an association. They went to the Association of Legal Administrators, where they met executive directors. They met all the other people who are running the administrative fabric, and they became friends with those people or colleagues of those people. We stayed in an insular pond with our talking to each other, which is great, but we really should have been doing both. And I remember thinking this years ago, ALL should actually, at least in law firms, law librarians and law firms should have a dual membership. They shouldn't only belong to ALL. They should belong to an ABA, SIS, and like I was recently asked to be the co-chair of the Knowledge Strategy Group in the ABA, which I took on because I think it is important for us to have librarian presence. I'm not the only one, but I was honored to be given that opportunity. I was recently asked to join the College of Law Practice Management. Again, another organization that has very few librarians in it. And so I was given that opportunity. And when I have opportunities to belong to an organization other than librarians, I think that is where I do my best work to promote the value of libraries. If I can inspire other librarians at ALL, of course I want to do that. But I think our more important issue is to get out to other organizations. That is how we get the message out. I mean, in the past year, I've spent more time talking outside of AAL almost than inside AAL, and that's been a wonderful opportunity for me. And I think I know other of my colleagues do it as well, but we need more of that, and that ought to be a theme within AAL.
The academics, at least the top ones in each school, have almost always had involvement in the Association of American Law Schools, and to some extent the American Bar Association.
Right, and I think
the legal education part of it.
Right, and I think that has been less true in law firms, and I think that is another thing that needs to change. But I mean, when I look back on it, I said, because actually, I'll tell you when the light bulb went on for me. Mm-hmm. We had, later on, I went to Wilmer. I guess I should transition now. I was working for myself, and after a year,
now you're
let me move forward. Joan Axelroth, another wonderful librarian who went out, who succeeded as a consultant, came to me and said that Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering was recruiting. They had been I had seen that job posted. They were recruiting for a year. They didn't know if they wanted a librarian or an MBA or they didn't know what they wanted. But you know how they defined it? They wanted someone who was not a traditional librarian. And that has been actually a theme in all of my jobs. People wanted someone who they didn't, in their mind, as much as we like to think there is no stereotype out there, there is a stereotype out there. And so that was a wonderful, I had no reason to stay in New York. I had come to DC and always loved DC for the monuments, for the history, for the fact that you can see the sky anywhere in DC. I love. So I moved to DC, and it was a wonderful adventure. And a lot of people said, "How can you do that? You don't know anybody there?" I said, if it's a mistake, I can move back to New York, but why not? And I was glad that I had the ability and it was a wonderful opportunity. And so it was interesting. So let me tell you what the interesting things were about that job. Again, it was a library that had not been strategically staffed. There were some really good people there, but the organization it wasn't run like a business. We had tons of books. Just ears coming. It was a huge library. And so, but on the interview, what they said to me is, when can you give us a library the size of a phone booth? They had a vision of initiating KM projects and going digital. And it was, for that reason, I was very attracted to the job, because they clearly wanted to go, they didn't want somebody who was going to do what we have always done. I had to still do that. But they wanted me to undertake new things. And my answer to that question was, as soon as the materials are digital, not everything is digital, as soon as it's available digitally in a format with the usability lawyers are willing to adopt to, and available at a price the firm is willing to pay. I said, it can all be done, but it's going to take time. And we began moving in that direction. And I will never forget this. When I got to Wilmer, they had a huge appellate litigation with 3 sets of the federal reporters. We had 2 people that spent the full day, full-time shelvers that just shelved federal reporters. It was an amazing operation, and luckily we were able to move all of that digitally. And I had another encounter with a partner who could not imagine living without the Shepherds, and I kept saying, no one uses the books. No one uses the books.
Even the old-fashioned paper ones.
Well, he insisted that there could not be a law firm without Shepherds. So I took the Barty Wolf trick. I put rubber bands around them. And we finally were able to get rid of them. The other pivotal moment there was a partner, a wonderful partner who had come from the SEC, Brandon Becker, had me come into his office, and he said, today I was talking to a client, and something had happened. He said, that client knew something I didn't know. I want you to know that I think it's your job to make sure that never happens again. And that, while we had always done a little bit of we had the Eclipse and West Clip, we did a little bit of clipping. It was my light bulb moment for the strategic importance to a law firm, to a lawyer, to look good, to always look better than his client. And I realized this was like just an incredible opportunity where we should be proactively delivering business information. And so I believe we set up a Factiva account, which had wonderful ability to target information for him. So we that became another passion, was moving in the direction while we were still digitizing. That became, I think I was an early adopter of the competitive intelligence services within libraries. We also went very digital. We did we built a KM system using Fulcrum software. I had a lot of wonderful opportunities there. And then, that firm also went through what was called a merger of equals with Hale and Dorr. And for many of my colleagues who have been through law firm mergers, they're quite astonishing. The most astonishing thing of all was that my peer on the Hale and Dorr side was a former colleague from New York, Jane Houston. And Jane Houston and I had both met at Connell the first year we went to ALL.
Oh,
We had
yeah.
met and became friends because of Connell. We worked in firms in New York, and then Jane went to work for them. And it was quite uncomfortable because we now had the same job, and throughout these, to the press, firms always say, "Oh, it's a merger of equals. Everybody's happy. This is easy," and this for the staff, it's quite traumatic to figure out who has the optimal process, who has the optimal strategy, and so, we were fortunate. Jane and I, the firm actually let us carve up the universe, and so I took over the traditional library, the library, competitive intelligence, the online services. Jane did more the intranet and KM, which, I was sorry to lose that. I would like to have stayed involved in that, but, I think it was better for each of us to have our own domain, and some of the other directors had to do co-directing for many years, and we were fortunate enough not to have to do that. So that worked out well for us. So I ended up. The other thing I'd like to say about Wilmer is it had such an incredibly interesting appellate practice. Seth Waxman was there, and he would often, come to us. He was getting ready to do Supreme Court arguments, and it was a place where excellence was everything. I mean, you had to have bulletproof answers to everything you did. If I learned there to write clearly. I have to say, Wilmer was very formative in that it was a firm that did, you wouldn't dare to send out an ill-crafted email or, missing, it really upped my game because it was, as demanding as they were of the attorneys, they were that demanding of the staff. The other wonderful thing that happened there was that I met someone who is still a friend of mine, and you asked about who were mentors. He was not a librarian. His name was Ron Friedman. He's still a consultant today. I was interviewed by a panel of people. There were multiple interviews, multiple panels. And he interviewed me, and I was like, oh boy, this guy is never, I've lost him. He was very methodical. I could tell immediately he was a consultant. I mean, he scared the living daylights out of me. Anyway, I got the job, and we began working together. And because he had been a lawyer and also a consultant at Bain, he taught me how to think like a consultant. He taught me, showed me how consultants do these graphs about, cost benefit and using spreadsheets, and he taught me about scenario planning and how to model out, one of the most interesting things we did was to model out a way to charge to develop our own flat fee or our own blended rate for cost recovery, rather than having lawyers have to know 4,000 price points. We did an analysis. I'll have to confess, it was mostly Ron. He did the spreadsheets. We talked about it together. We came up with this model. He taught me how to do it, and I redid that when I came here to DLA Piper, because one of the ironies, and I wrote this in one of my early blog posts, that the myth and the madness of cost-effective legal research, is that Lexis and Westlaw sort of killed the golden goose by making cost recovery so incomprehensible. That the focus completely shifted off, how do I quickly get the best answer for the client, into how do I figure out how to not use online research so it won't cost anything? I mean, there's just sheer terror because of the complexity. And so when you introduce flat fee billing or a single blended rate, and you say to lawyers, if you're on 10 minutes, you know exactly how much it's going to cost. It actually ended up improving cost recovery because it became very predictable. So that was a wonderful transformational moment, and and I did it. It was extremely successful there, and it was successful when I introduced it here at DLA Piper. So, but again, I really credit Ron with introducing me to things that sadly were not taught in library school, and I absolutely think should be taught today. And in fact, I'm on a panel at St. John's University Library School. Ralph Monaco had me introduced to this where the dean is trying to put together a special management program. And I think this kind of strategic thinking, value modeling, this is, I understand not every librarian wants to become a director or a leader or a CKO, but those who do should be able to learn those things in library schools. Those should be core skills. So you know how to look at what you're doing and say, what is the total cost of providing this service? Not just what's on the invoice, but what's the cost of staffing, what's the cost of invoicing, or what's the cost of driving lawyers off of a service that you've already paid for, Yeah. So he has been a wonderful influence in terms of what I refer to in shorthand as teaching me to think like a consultant. And so, again, moving on, I had been at Wilmer for many years. There were a lot of changes going on there, and the opportunity came up here at DLA Piper. And the other nice thing was there are not a lot of large firm opportunities here in D.C. They posted the job as they were willing for it to be in any office where they had a large. If they had a large office somewhere in the United States, you could work there. And fortunately, they had one in D.C. So it was like one of the few things where I wasn't going to have to relocate my family to take a new job. And so I came here at the end of 2007, right as the big recession was about to hit. And I'm so to this day I am eternally grateful that I was sort of like the last in, and remarkably I survived. Yeah, I mean, that was an incredibly scary time because, that was the year when we began to see there's not going to be a summer associate class. There's not going to be things that were unheard of. No summer associates, no fall associates. And so anyway,
the whole system changed.
Yes, I mean,
overnight.
It was like it was like you were. I don't want to use a really frightening analogy, but it was like being inside of a ship that's in a storm. It is like things are just rolling, and it's like, how are we ever going to get out of this? Everything is flying around. Nothing's where it used to be. What can you assume to be true anymore? Because things that were rock bottom, core to the way lawyers recruited, core to the way we operated, everything was being questioned. So, luckily, we had a terrific staff here at DLA Piper. The thing that I did notice immediately, because DLA Piper wasn't just the merger of two firms, it was the merger of three large firms in the United States, Gray Carey on the West Coast, Rudnick and Wolf in Chicago, and Marbury and Madison, who is the original. Piper Marbury. Sorry, I'm referring back, and they actually are related to the Supreme Court case people. And all of those firms had actually integrated other smaller firms. So I wasn't just integrating the three large firms. They were like multiple cultures from many different legacy firms. So it was an incredibly complicated organization. And, immediately I noticed that they were, the licenses, there were licenses all over the place. I used to refer to it as the land of 1,000 databases. We owned it. The books weren't just the problem. West Publishing actually told me we had the largest print collection of West books outside the federal government.
Wow.
Just huge. Because every office sort of operated independently. And so, I sort of took stock of things around the country, and I immediately knew, and I immediately told the staff, I am going to have to act like an outside consultant, because I guarantee if I do not approach this as an outsider, the firm will, I don't know when, it could be next week, it could be 5 years from now, if we do not change ourselves someone will be brought in to change us.